The sun rose over the quiet lake, casting golden reflections on the water that rippled gently in the morning breeze. It was the kind of morning that made the protagonist smile and stretch, feeling the calm satisfaction of owning a piece of paradise. The lake had always been a sanctuary, a place where the hum of everyday life could be left far behind. Birds sang softly, and the faint scent of pine filled the air. Here, life was simple, predictable, and completely under their control. But for Karen, mornings were never simple. Karen was the neighbor everyone knew, or at least everyone knew about her. She was always in motion, always watching, always offering advice that wasn't really advice but more like instructions. Karen had a passion for order, rules, and making sure everyone followed the right way to live by the lake. To her, this meant joining the lake HOA and keeping up with all its expectations. She had a way of speaking that made it feel as though she was the authority on everything, from the exact height of garden fences to the proper angle for lawn chairs. The protagonist had lived by the lake for years and had cultivated a routine that brought peace, not rules. They enjoyed tending to their property in their own style, free from anyone else's opinions or oversight. There were flower beds with blooms of every color, a small wooden dock stretching into the water, and a hammock tied between two sturdy pines where afternoons could be spent reading or watching the clouds drift by. It was a life carefully designed for relaxation and enjoyment, and the protagonist had no intention of changing it for anyone. Karen, however, had made it her mission to get the protagonist on board with the Lake HOA. She had stopped by more times than anyone could count, each visit beginning with cheerful greetings that slowly gave way to subtle hints about rules, community standards, and participation. The protagonist always responded politely, thanking her for the information, but making it clear they preferred not to join. It wasn't about being difficult or oppositional. It was about maintaining autonomy. The protagonist understood the value of community, but also valued the freedom to manage their own property in their own way. Every polite refusal from the protagonist seemed to fuel Karen's persistence. One Saturday morning, as the protagonist sipped coffee on the porch overlooking the water, Karen appeared again, clipboard in hand and determination in her stride. She waved enthusiastically, as if this time the conversation might go differently. The protagonist gave a small, courteous wave in return, mentally preparing for what was likely to come. "Good morning," Karen called from the edge of the property line. "I just wanted to check in and see if you've thought about joining the Lake HOA. We have a new program for members and it's really beneficial." The protagonist set the coffee cup down and smiled. "Good morning, Karen. I appreciate you stopping by, but I'm still happy managing things my way." Karen's brow furrowed slightly. "Oh, but it really makes life easier. You wouldn't have to worry about anything. You'd have support, guidance, and access to all the amenities." "I understand," the protagonist replied calmly, "but I'm comfortable handling things on my own. I like the way I do it." Karen pursed her lips, clearly trying to find the right argument. The protagonist remained seated, relaxed, radiating calm confidence. There was no anger, no confrontation, just a simple, unwavering position. As Karen turned to leave, the protagonist thought about how amusing it was that someone could be so determined to influence their life when, in reality, the land had been theirs all along. They leaned back in the chair, taking another sip of coffee, and watched Karen retreat down the path toward the street, clipboard held tightly like a shield. It was a small victory, but it set the stage for the events to come. The lake remained calm, the sun continued its slow climb in the sky, and the protagonist knew that life would go on exactly as they wanted, at least for now. Little did Karen know her next move would lead to a surprising and unforgettable revelation. Karen walked down the quiet lane toward the main road, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. In her mind, this was far from over. She had always been determined, and when something didn't go according to plan, she doubled down. Today was no exception. She muttered under her breath about people who just don't understand the benefits of structure, unaware that the protagonist was watching her retreat from the porch, a faint smile playing at the corners of their lips. The lake glistened under the mid-morning sun, the waves catching light like scattered diamonds. It was a scene that would have calmed most people, but for Karen, it was a reminder that control was still just out of reach. The protagonist, on the other hand, found the view inspiring. Every detail of the property reflected years of careful planning, a testament to independence and creativity. The garden bloomed in unexpected colors, the dock stretched perfectly into the water, and the small wooden deck was furnished exactly as they wanted. comfortable and functional without a hint of uniformity. It was proof that things could thrive without outside interference. Corinne's first stop after leaving the protagonist's property was a neighbor's house. She whispered animatedly about her concern for the lake community and how she intended to persuade the protagonist to reconsider. She laid out plans in a low, hurried voice, explaining the benefits of HOA membership as if the listener would instantly understand the gravity of the situation. But even as she spoke, there was a tension in her shoulders, a subtle indication that things weren't going entirely her way. Meanwhile, back at the protagonist's property, life continued with calm efficiency. They moved between the garden and the dock, checking on the flowers and securing the small boat tied at the edge of the water. There was a sense of satisfaction in handling everything themselves, in knowing that no one else could dictate the pace or pattern of life here. The solitude was not loneliness, it was control, freedom, and peace. By mid-afternoon, Corinne's frustration began to simmer. Her previous visits had resulted in polite refusals, but now she considered her next step. She decided that outside help might be necessary, not because there was any problem, but because she needed the situation resolved in a way that matched her expectations. With a decisive nod to herself, she picked up the phone and dialed the local authorities, carefully framing her words. She didn't call to complain in anger. She called to clarify the situation, a move that sounded responsible and necessary in her own mind. The protagonist noticed a subtle change in the neighborhood energy that afternoon. A police car arrived slowly at the entrance to the lake road, its presence calm but noticeable. The officer stepped out, notebook in hand, and approached the protagonist's property. There was no urgency in their steps, only curiosity and a professional approach to understanding the situation. The protagonist greeted them politely, offering a firm handshake and a warm smile. Corinne appeared moments later, still carrying her clipboard and a determined expression. She waved to the officer as though to guide them to the problem. "Thank you for coming," she said briskly. "I just wanted to make sure everything with the Lake HOA is in order. This property, well, it seems like the owner might not be participating." The protagonist remained calm, holding a stack of legal documents in one hand. "Good afternoon," they said. "I believe everything is in perfect order here. I manage this property myself, and I'm happy to clarify any questions you have." Corinne's confident smile faltered slightly. She had expected agreement, maybe even hesitation from the protagonist, but certainly not calm composure backed by clear authority. The officer paused, flipping through a notebook, glancing between Corinne and the protagonist with a subtle lift of an eyebrow. The tension in the air was quiet but palpable. Corinne's persistence had met a wall of calm certainty, and the protagonist was fully prepared to maintain it. The garden swayed in the gentle breeze, the dock creaked softly under the weight of sunlight and water, and the lake seemed to hold its breath. It was only a matter of time before the truth emerged, a truth that Corinne had never considered, and that would change the course of this encounter entirely. For now, she stood on the property line, clipboard trembling slightly, while the protagonist remained seated on the porch, coffee in hand, radiating confidence and calm control. The stage was set for a revelation that neither Corinne nor the neighbors would soon forget. The local officer stepped onto the property with a calm, professional air, taking in the scene with a curious eye. The lake glimmered behind the protagonist, the dock stretching gracefully into the water, and the flowers along the walkway seemed to brighten under the afternoon sun. Everything looked peaceful, orderly, and above all, clearly cared for. It was immediately apparent that the property was well-loved and meticulously maintained. Corinne, meanwhile, hovered near the edge of the lawn, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. Her earlier confidence had started to waver, replaced by a faint tension in her shoulders. She had envisioned a quick resolution. The officer would check in, nod at her concerns, and persuade the protagonist to join the HOA. Instead, she found herself standing on the property of someone who looked calm, collected, and fully in control. "Good afternoon," the protagonist said, stepping forward from the porch. They extended a hand to the officer with a warm, confident smile. "I'm happy to provide any clarification you need regarding my property." The officer returned the handshake, notebook in hand. "Thank you. I'm here to understand the situation. I received a call regarding some questions about HOA participation." Corinne perked up, eager to speak first. "Yes, I'm just concerned that this property isn't participating in the Lake HOA. I thought maybe the owner wasn't aware of the benefits. We really try to keep everything organized and consistent." The protagonist held up a hand politely, preventing Karen from going further. "I appreciate your concern," they said calmly, "but everything here is handled according to my ownership and personal management. I maintain the property myself, and I am fully aware of the HOA programs. Participation is my choice, and I've chosen to manage things independently." The officer nodded slowly, jotting notes. "That's fair. Can you show me your proof of ownership?" The protagonist smiled, reaching into a neat folder and handing over the stack of documents. Each page was organized, clear, and legally precise: deed, property tax records, and the full paperwork confirming their ownership. The officer flipped through the documents, eyebrows raising slightly at the thoroughness. Karen's smile faltered. She had assumed ownership would be less formal, perhaps shared or leased through someone else. Seeing the stack of official papers made her pause. "Well, I didn't realize," she began, but her voice trailed off. The protagonist continued calmly. "I understand your dedication to the community, Karen, but as the property owner, I'm responsible for how this land is managed. I'm perfectly happy with the way things are." The officer looked between the two of them, a faint smile playing on their lips. "It seems everything is in order here. The property is well cared for and the owner is fully aware of all relevant programs. There's no issue." Karen's face turned a shade paler. She hadn't expected this outcome, and her carefully constructed confidence was crumbling. She shuffled her feet, glanced down at the clipboard, and muttered something under her breath. The officer, professional but perceptive, noticed and raised an eyebrow. "Is there anything else I can help clarify?" the officer asked the protagonist. "No, thank you," the protagonist replied. "Everything is perfectly managed, and I'm happy to continue as I have been." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but found herself at a loss for words. Every attempt she had made to enforce a certain expectation had been met with calm certainty and clear evidence. The reality was undeniable. The protagonist was the rightful owner, fully in control, and completely capable of managing the property on their own terms. The officer closed the folder, nodding politely. "Well, it looks like everything is settled. I appreciate your time." Karen, still stunned, muttered something about community standards, but quickly realized she had no authority in the situation. She retreated slowly down the lawn, clipboard held tightly but no longer a shield, more like a reminder of her misjudgment. The protagonist watched her leave, leaning back on the porch with a satisfied smile. There was a quiet triumph in the air, subtle but unmistakable. The sun reflected on the lake, the flowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the dock remained solid and welcoming. Life was calm, ordered, and entirely under the protagonist's control. As the officer waved goodbye and returned to their car, the protagonist returned to their coffee, taking a slow sip while glancing at the departing Karen. The lake remained as peaceful as ever, but the sense of quiet victory lingered in the air. The first challenge had been met, and it had been handled with patience, clarity, and grace. It was only a matter of time before Karen processed what had happened, and when she did, the shock would be complete. For now, the protagonist settled into the comfort of the lake, knowing that calm confidence and knowledge had triumphed over persistence and assumption. Karen stood at the edge of the protagonist's property, her clipboard now dangling loosely by her side. She had expected a brief encounter, maybe a gentle reminder to the protagonist about the HOA, but instead, she had been met with calm authority and a stack of undeniable legal documents. The reality was sinking in, and it was almost too much for her to process. The officer gave a polite nod and stepped back, leaving Karen to face the truth on her own. The protagonist remained seated on the porch, coffee in hand, radiating calm confidence. The sun highlighted the carefully tended flowers, the well-maintained dock, and the perfect stretch of lawn that reflected years of attentive care. Everything was a testament to ownership, control, and independence. Karen's eyes flicked down to the documents once more. There it was in black and white, the deed, the property tax records, all clearly indicating that the protagonist was the rightful owner of the land. For the first time, she realized the entire situation had been entirely in her own imagination. She had been attempting to persuade the person who had the final say on everything. I didn't realize," Karen stammered, her confident tone gone, replaced with a mix of surprise and disbelief. "I thought." The protagonist smiled gently. "I understand, Karen. It's easy to assume things, especially when you're used to helping others. But in this case, the land has been in my name for quite some time. I manage it myself, and I am happy with the way things are." Karen blinked, clearly trying to process the information. She had imagined resistance, stubbornness, maybe a polite refusal, but not this level of authority backed by legal proof. It was a revelation she hadn't been prepared for, and the weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. The neighbors, who had gathered quietly a short distance away, exchanged glances. Some had known the protagonist for years, aware of their independence and attentiveness, but even they hadn't witnessed a confrontation like this. The scene unfolded almost theatrically. Karen frozen in realization, the officer calmly observing, and the protagonist composed, serene, and utterly confident. Karen's mind raced. She had planned every angle, every phrase, every possible outcome. None of it accounted for the fact that the protagonist owned the land outright. None of it accounted for the calm certainty with which the protagonist presented the facts. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, glancing again at the neatly organized documents that had shattered her assumptions. I suppose I should have checked the records, Karen muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Her usual boldness had dissipated, replaced by a quiet acknowledgement of the situation. I thought I was helping. You were, the protagonist said kindly, setting down their coffee. Your intentions were clear, but in this case there's nothing to correct or enforce. Everything here is managed as it should be. The officer gave a polite nod, closing their notebook. It seems like everything is in order. I'm glad it could be clarified. Karen nodded, her confidence still shaken but slowly regaining some composure. She had to retreat, both physically and mentally, from the situation that had gone completely sideways. As she walked back toward the main lane, she cast one last glance at the protagonist. For a moment there was no anger, no frustration, just the dawning realization that her assumptions had been completely overturned. The protagonist leaned back in the porch chair, taking a slow sip of coffee, and watched Karen disappear down the lane. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon sun, the gentle breeze carrying the soft sound of water lapping against the dock. The moment felt both peaceful and victorious, a quiet affirmation of independence and calm authority. For the neighbors who had witnessed the scene, it was a lesson in clarity, patience, and quiet confidence. For Karen, it was an unforgettable moment of revelation, a humbling experience that would shape her understanding of boundaries and ownership. And for the protagonist, it was a reminder that knowledge, calmness, and preparation could transform a challenging encounter into a moment of graceful triumph. As the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm golden glow across the lake, the protagonist reflected on the events of the day. Life at the lake continued as it always had, peaceful and orderly, with one subtle but important difference. Karen would think twice before assuming she could influence someone who had full authority over their own property. The revelation was complete, and the protagonist settled into the comfort of their surroundings. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the dock creaked softly under the weight of sunlight, and the water reflected the calm, confident presence of someone who knew their rights and embraced them fully. Life at the lake would continue, serene and undisturbed, and the memory of the revelation would linger as a quiet but powerful testament to clarity, independence, and respect. Karen walked down the lane, her steps hesitant and uneven, her clipboard now swinging loosely at her side. Each step felt heavier than the last as the realization of what had just occurred replayed in her mind. She had expected compliance, perhaps polite resistance, maybe even a few gentle compromises, but not this. She had been confronted with undeniable proof that the protagonist owned the property outright. It was a truth she had overlooked, assuming that her helpful guidance was welcome. Back on the porch, the protagonist leaned back in their chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of their lips. They watched Karen's retreat with calm amusement, sipping the last of their coffee as the afternoon sun reflected off the lake. Life had a way of settling itself when approached with patience and clarity, they thought. The property was theirs, the boundaries were clear, and Karen's assumptions had been gently but firmly corrected. Karen, however, was not one to leave a situation unfinished, even when the truth was clear. She stopped near a neighbor's mailbox and pulled out her phone, fingers tapping nervously. "Maybe if I explain differently," she muttered. She started composing a message, her words carefully chosen to soften the impact while still emphasizing her concern. It was a delicate balance: admit nothing, assert authority subtly, and leave the door open for continued influence. Meanwhile, neighbors who had quietly observed the exchange from a distance began to discuss what they had seen. Whispers of admiration for the protagonist's calm composure and clarity spread along the street. Some exchanged glances, nodding in silent acknowledgement that handling situations with patience and preparation often led to better outcomes than confrontation. Coren's retreat and quiet muttering only emphasized the effectiveness of the protagonist's approach. Coren returned to her car with her phone still in hand, drafting another message, this time with slightly more humor to soften the sting of her own misjudgment. "Just checking in," she typed. "Thought I might have overlooked something. I guess I was wrong. My apologies." She paused, rereading the note. It felt strange to write words that acknowledged someone else's authority and correctness. Normally, she was confident, assertive, and ready with instructions for everyone else, but not this time. Back on the porch, the protagonist organized a few more papers, glanced at the garden, and shook their heads slightly in quiet amusement. Coren's persistence had been impressive in its own way, if nothing else, but it had been no match for clear knowledge and patience. The flowers swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, and the dock creaked softly as if echoing the calm triumph of the moment. Later that evening, Coren attempted to save face in a neighborly conversation, speaking carefully and diplomatically about the lake HOA. She emphasized her concern for community participation while skillfully avoiding any mention of ownership disputes. Her words were measured, polite, and slightly apologetic, but it was clear that she had learned a lesson. Assumptions could lead to unexpected revelations, and authority without knowledge was fragile. The protagonist, meanwhile, settled into the calm of the evening, walking slowly along the dock and dipping their hand into the cool water. The lake reflected the soft orange glow of the setting sun, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of pine and blooming flowers. The events of the day replayed in their mind, but instead of frustration or anger, there was quiet satisfaction. They had handled the situation with patience, clarity, and humor, and the boundaries of their property and their peace remained intact. Coren, as she drove home, couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. It was humbling, even slightly amusing in retrospect. She realized that her usual tactics of persuasion and gentle insistence would need reevaluation. The protagonist had set a standard for calm authority and clear boundaries that she had not anticipated. Even as she planned her next move, a small voice inside reminded her to approach the situation differently, with respect for the facts and the person in charge. By the time night fell, the lake was calm and still, reflecting stars in the clear water. The protagonist sat on the porch, a warm blanket over their shoulders, watching the gentle ripples. Life had returned to its peaceful rhythm, undisturbed by assumptions or pressure. Coren's reaction had been a lesson in humility, and the protagonist's calm confidence had ensured that independence and peace remained unchallenged. As the stars sparkled above, the protagonists smiled quietly to themselves, knowing that knowledge, patience, and a little humor had turned what could have been a confrontation into a graceful affirmation of control and clarity. Coren had learned a subtle but important lesson, and the lake remained exactly as it should, calm, beautiful, and entirely under the guidance of the person who truly owned it. The day after the surprising encounter, the lake seemed even quieter than usual. The sun rose slowly, painting the water in shimmering gold, and the gentle rustle of leaves accompanied the soft calls of early birds. The protagonist stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee in hand, taking in the familiar sights of their property. The dock remained perfectly aligned, the flowers bloomed in joyful chaos, and the air carried the peaceful scent of pine and water. Everything felt calm, reassuring, and entirely under their control. Coren, on the other hand, was a few houses down, packing in her driveway and replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. The encounter had shaken her confidence more than she had expected. She had assumed authority, but the protagonist's calm and clear presentation of facts had left her flustered and speechless. Even now, she was reconsidering how she approached situations, realizing that assumptions and persistence alone did not guarantee influence. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, enjoying the lake morning with cups of coffee, jogging along the paths, or walking their dogs. Some had witnessed Coren's retreat and quietly admired the protagonist's composed handling of the situation. A few even approached, complimenting the protagonist's calm demeanor and how gracefully they had managed an unexpected confrontation. The protagonist nodded politely, appreciating the gestures but not letting the attention disrupt their morning routine. Independence, after all, was as much about maintaining peace as it was about standing firm. By mid-morning, Coren had returned, carefully attempting to engage the protagonist in conversation without causing another scene. She approached the porch with a tentative smile and a clipboard that seemed more symbolic than necessary. "Good morning," she said, trying to sound lighthearted. "I just wanted to check in, make sure everything is running smoothly. I hope I didn't cause any trouble yesterday." The protagonist looked up from their coffee, offering a polite smile. "Good morning, Karen. Everything is fine, no trouble at all. The property is as it should be." Karen nodded, glancing around at the well-tended garden and pristine dock. She had expected resistance, chaos, or at least a sense of tension, but everything was calm, orderly, and thriving. "I see. Yes, everything looks wonderful," she admitted, her tone softened. Neighbors passing by exchanged glances and subtle smiles. It was clear that the protagonist had not only defended their property, but had also demonstrated patience, clarity, and confidence. The lesson was visible to everyone. Calm, informed authority carried far more weight than persistent urging or assumptions. As the day unfolded, the protagonist tended to small chores around the property, adjusting garden beds, securing the boat, and making minor improvements to the dock. Karen lingered in the background, occasionally offering suggestions, but her voice was measured and polite. The dynamic had shifted subtly. She had learned the importance of approach, respect, and clarity. By afternoon, a few neighbors stopped by to chat. They asked about the previous day's events, curious but careful not to pry too much. The protagonist recounted the encounter calmly, focusing on facts, clarity, and the importance of maintaining independence. Laughter occasionally punctuated the conversation, especially at Karen's befuddled expressions and her attempts to regain composure. Everyone left with a sense of admiration and the knowledge that the protagonist had handled the situation with grace. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the lake and golden light on the dock. Karen, finally leaving for the day, paused one last time to glance at the property. There was a subtle acknowledgement in her eyes, a quiet recognition that the protagonist's independence and authority were firmly established. She left with a mixture of humility and newfound respect, the encounter shaping her approach for future interactions. The protagonist, now alone on the porch again, watched the water ripple in the gentle breeze. Life had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The property was secure, well-managed, and untouched by unnecessary interference. The events of the past days had strengthened the sense of calm and satisfaction that came from standing firm with knowledge and patience. As twilight settled over the lake, the protagonist leaned back, sipping the last of their coffee and taking in the serene view. Birds sang their final songs, and the water mirrored the deepening hues of the evening sky. Independence had been reaffirmed, boundaries respected, and the tranquility of the lake preserved. For the neighbors, the day had been a subtle lesson in patience, clarity, and respect. For Karen, it had been a humbling but instructive experience. And for the protagonist, it was a quiet victory, a confirmation that life at the lake could continue exactly as intended, calm, orderly, and entirely under their control. The lake was quiet again the next morning, with the gentle lapping of water against the dock creating a peaceful rhythm that set the tone for the day. The protagonist stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee, surveying the property that had become a symbol of patience, knowledge, and calm authority. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, the boat bobbed lightly at the dock, and the sunlight glittered across the water. Everything seemed perfectly in order, a visual reminder that independence and care could coexist harmoniously. Karen, meanwhile, was walking slowly along the lane, her usual brisk confidence replaced with careful consideration. The encounter from the previous days replayed in her mind like a loop of lessons. She had assumed influence through persistence, but it had been clear that facts and clarity carried more weight than determination alone. Her approach to the lake, the neighbors, and even the HOA had to change, and she couldn't deny the quiet authority the protagonist had displayed. The neighbors, aware of the recent events, began to approach the protagonist throughout the day. One by one, they stopped by to share small gestures of admiration and curiosity. "I saw what happened the other day," one neighbor said with a smile. "You handled everything so calmly. I think we could all learn a little from your approach." Another neighbor chuckled as they set down a basket of fresh fruit. "I had my doubts about how things would go with Karen, but you made it look effortless. Patience really does pay off." The protagonist accepted each gesture with modest acknowledgement, knowing that the true satisfaction came from maintaining a calm and balanced approach. The lake life wasn't about triumph over others. It was about clarity, preparation, and ensuring peace for oneself and those around. Later, Karen tentatively approached again, this time with a slightly different demeanor. She offered a polite nod and a careful smile. "Good afternoon," she said. "I've been thinking about our conversation. I realize I may have overstepped before. I just wanted to acknowledge that everything is in order here." The protagonist smiled warmly. "Thank you, Karen. I appreciate your concern. Everything is well managed, and I'm happy to continue as I have been. Karen nodded, a small laugh escaping her lips. I suppose I still have a lot to learn about boundaries and patience, she admitted. You've set quite an example. The day continued with light-hearted interactions between neighbors, all subtly acknowledging the lessons of the previous encounter. The protagonist walked the property, checking on the flower beds, making minor adjustments to the dock, and enjoying the simple satisfaction of a day unfolding calmly. Each task reinforced the idea that control, knowledge, and attention to detail were far more effective than pressure or assumption. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lake, the protagonist paused at the water's edge. They dipped a hand into the cool, clear water, feeling the gentle pull of the lake and the reflection of the sky above. It was a moment of quiet reflection, a reminder that life moved best when guided by clarity, calmness, and respect for both oneself and others. Karen, watching from a respectful distance, adjusted her approach in subtle ways. She began to engage neighbors with politeness and attentiveness rather than insistence, learning that influence was earned through understanding and patience, not assumption. Every interaction reminded her of the day she had been confronted with undeniable truth, and she could feel herself growing more thoughtful, more measured. Neighbors who had witnessed the events quietly shared lessons among themselves. Conversations about respect, patience, and the balance between independence and cooperation became common, though always with light humor and gentle admiration for the protagonist's approach. Laughter occasionally punctuated the discussions, especially when recalling Karen's initially flustered expressions and attempts to regain composure. As twilight settled over the lake, the protagonist returned to the porch with a sense of calm satisfaction. Birds sang their final songs, and the water mirrored the soft glow of the evening sky. Independence had been reaffirmed, lessons had been learned, and boundaries had been respected, all without conflict or chaos. The protagonist leaned back, sipping the last of the coffee, watching as the sky turned pink and gold. Life at the lake had settled into a rhythm that balanced freedom, clarity, and community interaction. Karen had learned her own lessons, neighbors had witnessed calm authority in action, and the protagonist had reinforced the value of patience, knowledge, and a touch of humor. In the quiet of the evening, the protagonists smiled to themselves. The lake remained a sanctuary, a place of serenity, and a testament to the power of calm, confident action. Lessons had been learned, boundaries respected, and life continued exactly as it should, peaceful, joyful, and entirely under the care of someone who truly knew the value of independence and grace. The lake was calm that morning, the water smooth like glass and reflecting the soft pastel colors of dawn. The protagonist stepped onto the porch, stretching and breathing deeply. After the past week's series of surprising events, the morning felt especially peaceful. Birds called softly from the trees, and the gentle rustle of leaves accompanied the sound of water lapping against the dock. Everything felt right, balanced, and entirely under the protagonist's care. Karen, still processing the events that had unfolded, approached cautiously from a distance. This time her steps were measured, her expressions subdued. She carried no clipboard, no list of instructions, no assumptions. Instead, there was a tentative respect in her eyes, a recognition that yesterday's confrontation had taught her an important lesson. She waved politely, and the protagonist waved back with a calm, welcoming smile. Neighbors began to emerge from their homes, enjoying the morning sun and the peaceful atmosphere. Conversations were light, friendly, and filled with subtle humor about the previous week. Some shared laughs about Karen's initial flustered reactions, while others quietly admired the protagonist's calm and composed handling of the situation. The lesson of the lake was clear. Patience, knowledge, and respect could achieve far more than insistence or assumption. Karen approached the protagonist holding a small tray of freshly baked cookies. "Good morning," she said carefully. "I thought I'd stop by and offer a small gesture. I realize things went differently than I expected, and I want to acknowledge that." The protagonist smiled warmly, setting down a cup of coffee. "Good morning, Karen. That's very thoughtful of you. Thank you. Everything here is perfectly managed, and I'm happy with the way things are." Karen nodded, a small laugh escaping her lips. "I suppose I still have much to learn about boundaries and patience," she admitted. "You've shown quite an example." The protagonist accepted the cookies, and they shared a moment of mutual understanding. There was no tension, no lingering frustration, just a simple acknowledgement that sometimes lessons were learned in unexpected ways. Throughout the day, the lake remained serene, and the protagonist moved about the property with ease and satisfaction. They tended to the garden, checked the dock, and adjusted the small boat bobbing gently in the water. Each task reinforced the sense of independence and calm that had carried them through the recent events. Even the neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering friendly greetings or brief conversations, always careful to respect the protagonist's space while enjoying the quiet camaraderie of the lakeside community. Karen, meanwhile, maintained her distance but observed from time to time. She had become more thoughtful in her approach, choosing her words carefully and showing subtle respect for the protagonist's decisions. The previous insistence had been replaced by consideration, and she was learning that influence and respect were earned, not demanded. By late afternoon, the protagonist settled on the porch with a light blanket and a book. The lake reflected the colors of the setting sun, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and flowers. Life had returned to its peaceful rhythm, with lessons learned, boundaries respected, and humor subtly woven into daily interactions. Karen's respect for the protagonist was quietly established, neighbors felt reassured by the calm example set, and the lake remained a sanctuary for all. As evening approached, the protagonist reflected on the week's events. The encounters had been unexpected, sometimes humorous and ultimately instructive. Knowledge, patience, and clear communication had transformed a potentially tense situation into one of quiet triumph. The lake, still and shimmering under the twilight sky, seemed to acknowledge the resolution. Finally, as the stars began to sparkle above the water, the protagonist took one last walk along the dock. The cool evening air brushed against their face, the water lapped gently against the posts, and the surrounding trees swayed softly. Everything felt in harmony, the property secure, life peaceful, and independence reaffirmed. Karen, from a respectful distance, gave a small wave, acknowledging both the protagonist's victory and her own growth. She had learned humility, patience, and the value of clear boundaries, while the protagonist had reaffirmed the calm strength of knowledge and composed action. With the lake reflecting the night sky, the protagonist returned to the porch, sipping the last of their coffee and smiling quietly. Life at the lake had settled into its perfect rhythm, full of serenity, humor, and satisfaction. Independence had been maintained, respect had been earned, and the gentle lessons of the lake would linger for everyone involved. The story closed with a final glance at the tranquil water, the dock, and the garden in full bloom. The protagonist's calm confidence had preserved the beauty and peace of the lake, leaving a lasting impression on neighbors and on Karen alike. Life continued as it should, peaceful, joyful, and entirely under the care of someone who knew the true value of patience, clarity, and grace.